How far can prejudice go before it destroys everything? When a young black girl, Aaliyah Morgan, is wrongfully arrested and humiliated, she refuses to stay silent. But what Detective Karen Mitchell doesn't know is that Aaliyah's father is a federal agent. Can justice be served before it's too late? Follow us to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel. The night was perfect. The kind of night Aaliyah Morgan had dreamed about for years. She stepped out of Lincoln Center, her heart still racing from the performance. The glow of the marquee lights reflected off her white dress, making her feel like she was still standing under the spotlight. The sound of applause lingered in her ears, blending with the soft hum of the city. Tonight, she had played her heart out, and the world had listened. Clutched tightly in her hands was the program booklet, proof of her accomplishment. She ran her fingers over the elegant print, Aaliyah Morgan, solo pianist, and smiled. This was her moment. As she walked toward the subway, the crisp night air wrapped around her like a soft embrace. The city was still alive, buzzing with late-night conversations, car horns, and distant music floating from street performers. New York never truly slept, and tonight neither would she, not out of exhaustion but out of pure excitement. But in the midst of her joy, she thought about her father, Malcolm Morgan. Aaliyah let out a breath, thinking about how proud he had been that morning. He had woken up early to braid her hair, something he always did for special occasions. It had become their tradition, his way of showing her that he cared, even when his job as a federal agent kept him away for long stretches. "This is your crown, Aaliyah," he had said, his large, strong hands working through her curls with surprising gentleness. "No matter where you go tonight, no matter who you stand in front of, remember, you're already royalty." And she had. With each note she played, with each movement of her fingers across the piano keys, she had carried his words with her. But now, walking home alone through Harlem, she felt the shift. That perfect feeling from the concert started to fade, replaced by a strange, creeping unease. Something wasn't right. She heard the engine before she saw the car, a police cruiser. Moving slowly, keeping pace with her steps. Aaliyah tried to shake off the uneasiness. Maybe it was just passing through. Maybe she was overthinking. She straightened her shoulders and kept walking, keeping her pace even. But the car didn't move on. It stayed. Her stomach clenched. Then came the flash of red and blue. She stopped. A voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the night. "Stop right there." Aaliyah turned, squinting under the harsh glare of the headlights. A woman stepped out of the cruiser, Detective Karen Mitchell. Tall, with a rigid posture and a look that screamed authority, she approached with slow, deliberate steps. Aaliyah could see the way her hand hovered over her belt, close to her holster. "ID. Now." Aaliyah blinked, her fingers instinctively tightening around her program booklet. "Excuse me," she asked, keeping her voice level. "I said let me see some identification," Karen repeated, her tone edged with impatience. Aaliyah took a steady breath. This was nothing new. She had grown up hearing the warnings, the lectures from her father about what to do in situations like this. "Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. Don't argue. Comply." So she did. "May I ask why?" she said, carefully keeping her hands where the officer could see them. Karen narrowed her eyes. "It's late. You're walking alone. And that hairstyle," she gestured vaguely toward Aaliyah's braids. "I've seen it before. Gang-affiliated." Aaliyah felt her stomach drop. Her braids. The ones her father had spent an hour weaving this morning. A symbol of love and culture, now twisted into something ugly by someone who refused to see beyond her own biases. She swallowed the anger that threatened to rise. "Officer, I just finished a performance at Lincoln Center," she explained, keeping her tone calm. "I'm on my way home. I live just a few blocks from here." Karen's gaze flickered down to the program in Aaliyah's hands, but she didn't seem convinced. ID. Aaliyah slowly reached into her purse, but before she could pull it out, Karen snatched her bag away. Hey! Aaliyah gasped, stepping back. Karen didn't even hesitate. She unzipped the bag, rifling through its contents as if expecting to find something incriminating. Aaliyah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had done nothing wrong. Yet here she was, standing on a dimly lit sidewalk, being treated like a criminal for simply existing. Karen pulled out the program booklet and scoffed. This supposed to prove something, Aaliyah bit her tongue. She had been raised to respect authority, to be polite even when being mistreated. But tonight she felt something break inside her. It proves where I was tonight, she said, her voice colder now. Are we done? Karen stepped closer. Not quite. And before Aaliyah could react, the cuffs were on her wrists, cold metal biting into her skin. Her breath hitched. You're resisting a lawful search, Karen said. I'm taking you in for obstruction. Aaliyah's world tilted. She heard the words, but they felt distant, unreal. This wasn't happening. She had spent the night playing music that moved people to tears. She had stood in front of a packed concert hall, earning a standing ovation. She had been royalty on that stage, and now she was being dragged to a police station in handcuffs. Humiliation burned through her, hotter than the flashing lights reflecting in the wet pavement. She looked up, eyes locking onto Karen's, trying to find some humanity there. She found none. All she saw was someone who had already decided what kind of person she was before even speaking to her. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, Aaliyah caught a final glimpse of the program booklet lying abandoned on the sidewalk, soaking in a puddle. The proof of who she was, left behind, lost, just like the perfect night she thought she was having. The cold air inside Midtown North Police Station felt suffocating. The moment Aaliyah Morgan stepped through the doors, she felt every eye in the room land on her, some curious, some indifferent, and a few, like Officer Ryan Carter's, filled with silent discomfort. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the holding area. The entire place smelled like stale coffee, old paperwork, and disinfectant, but beneath it all was something thicker. The unspoken tension of a system that had seen too many stories like hers play out in the exact same way. Detective Karen Mitchell walked ahead, shoulders squared, every step exuding authority. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter, didn't acknowledge the growing unease that crept into the air like an unwelcome presence. For Aaliyah, the humiliation had already settled deep in her bones. She was a pianist, a performer, a girl who had played in front of an audience at one of the most prestigious venues in New York City just hours ago. And yet, here she was, standing in a police station, handcuffed like a criminal. Her wrists ached from the cold steel pressing into her skin, but she refused to shift, refused to let them see her flinch. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Sit. Karen's voice was clipped, businesslike, as she gestured toward a hard metal chair in the small, gray interrogation room. Aaliyah sat, carefully keeping her chin high, her face blank. She wouldn't let Karen see how deep the humiliation was cutting. Karen dropped a file onto the table, flipping it open with practiced ease. You want to tell me why you were walking around Harlem alone at this hour? Aaliyah didn't blink. I already did. Karen's jaw tightened. Let's go through it again. Aaliyah inhaled slowly, forcing patience into her voice. I had a performance at Lincoln Center. I was walking home. That's it. And yet you refused to cooperate when I asked for your ID. I never refused. Karen's brow arched. You hesitated. I asked why you needed it. That's not a crime. Silence. Ryan Carter stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had been quiet the entire time, but Aaliyah saw it in his eyes. The conflict, the doubt, the question of whether this was going too far. But he said nothing. Karen leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. That hairstyle, she gestured vaguely toward Aaliyah's braids, it's been associated with gangs in this area. Aaliyah's stomach twisted, but she didn't let her expression change. So, because I have braids, I must be in a gang, she asked, her voice steady. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Karen leaned back, exhaling sharply through her nose like she was growing impatient. Here's the problem, Miss Morgan, she said. We don't know who you really are. Maybe you're telling the truth. Or maybe you're connected to something bigger and you just happen to be a really good liar. Aaliyah's hands curled into fists in her lap. This wasn't about her innocence. It was about control, about power, about the fact that Karen had already made up her mind about her the moment she laid eyes on her, and there was nothing she could say to change it. Karen stood, reaching for the door handle. Search her belongings. Ryan finally spoke. Karen, we already searched her bag. There's nothing. Karen shot him a sharp look. Then we need to be thorough. Ryan hesitated, his shoulders stiff. She's a kid, a student. We don't need to. Do you want to let something slip through on your watch, Carter? Karen cut him off. A tense pause. Ryan didn't answer, and that was all the permission Karen needed. She turned back to Aaliyah, her expression cold, calculated. Take her to processing. Processing. A clinical word for what was about to happen. Aaliyah was led to a side room, a bright, sterile space that smelled of antiseptic and regret. The mirror on the wall reflected her back at herself, a girl in a white dress, cuffs on her wrists, her braids still neat despite everything. For now. Karen stood at the doorway as an older man, James, walked in. He carried a set of clippers, his expression weary. Cut them off, Karen ordered. Aaliyah went still. James hesitated. Detective, I don't think. It's protocol, Karen interrupted. She could be hiding something in that hair. Aaliyah's pulse pounded, not the braids, not the crown her father had given her. Her voice came out sharp, unyielding. You have no right, Karen smirked. You want to make this harder for yourself. Aaliyah turned to James, looking him straight in the eye. Don't do this. James looked away. A long pause stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Then, finally, he lifted the clippers. The first strand fell. Aaliyah didn't breathe. She felt the weight of each braid hitting the floor like pieces of herself being stripped away one by one. But she wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give Karen that. James's hands trembled as he worked. He wasn't rough, but he wasn't gentle either. His movements were efficient, detached, like he was trying to finish as quickly as possible. Karen watched, arms crossed, unmoved. When it was done, the air felt colder against Aaliyah's exposed scalp. She refused to touch it. Instead, she knelt, fingers brushing over the fallen braids on the floor. She gathered them in her hands like they were something precious, something sacred. Karen sighed, shaking her head. It's just hair. Aaliyah slowly stood, and for the first time that night she smiled. Not a smile of joy, not a smile of surrender, but a smile that said, You think you've broken me? You have no idea who I am. Karen's smirk faltered. And for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed through her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The steady hum of the police station was suddenly broken by the sharp ring of Captain Henry Thompson's desk phone. It was late, and most of the officers had settled into their usual rhythm, typing up reports, sipping stale coffee, and preparing for the long stretch of the graveyard shift. But the moment Thompson picked up the phone and heard the voice on the other end, the entire atmosphere shifted. Captain Thompson, this is Special Agent Robert Lasker with the FBI. We have a situation. Thompson leaned forward, his brows knitting together. The FBI calling at this hour was never a good sign. Go ahead, he said. What came next turned his blood cold. "The girl you have in holding, Aaliyah Morgan, she's the daughter of Malcolm Morgan." Thompson's grip on the phone tightened. "Morgan, as in?" "As in Special Agent Malcolm Morgan. He's been undercover for 3 years, infiltrating Vincent Delgado's syndicate, and your officers just arrested his daughter." Thompson's stomach dropped. Vincent Delgado was no ordinary criminal. He ran one of the most dangerous arms smuggling networks on the East Coast. Corrupt cops, politicians, mercenaries. He had them all in his pocket. Malcolm Morgan was the only man who had managed to infiltrate his ranks, feeding the FBI critical intelligence. If Delgado found out that his trusted associate's daughter had been picked up by police, his entire cover would be blown, and that meant Malcolm was a dead man. Thompson shot to his feet. Who the hell authorized this arrest? The FBI agent's voice was tense. "From what I was told, it was Detective Karen Mitchell." Thompson swore under his breath. Thompson didn't waste a second. He stormed out of his office, his face like stone, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and urgency. When he reached the main desk, his eyes locked onto Karen Mitchell, who was leaning casually against a filing cabinet, chatting with another officer. She looked completely unbothered, as if she had just wrapped up another routine arrest. Thompson saw red. "Mitchell!" He barked, his voice slicing through the room like a whip. Karen straightened instantly, eyes widening at the unmistakable fury in his tone. "Sir!" Thompson stopped in front of her, towering over her with the force of a brewing storm. "Do you have any damn idea what you've done?" Karen blinked, her posture stiffening. "Sir, I was following protocol. She was walking alone at night in a high-crime area. Her hairstyle—" "Shut up!" Thompson's voice boomed, making the room go dead silent. Every officer within earshot froze, their eyes darting between the captain and Karen. Thompson's hand slammed onto the nearest desk. "You arrested Aaliyah Morgan. You know who she is?" Karen frowned, clearly confused. "She's just some kid who got smart with me." Thompson laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "She's the daughter of a federal agent, you goddamn idiot." "And not just any agent, Malcolm Morgan." Karen went still. For the first time, her confidence cracked. "I what?" "Morgan is deep undercover in Delgado's network," Thompson growled. "And because of your stupidity, his entire cover is at risk. If Delgado finds out his daughter was arrested, he'll start asking questions. He'll dig. And when he does, he'll realize Morgan isn't who he says he is. And when that happens—" Thompson stabbed a finger at her chest. "His blood is on your hands." Karen felt the floor beneath her shift. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't supposed to be this. She had thought she was keeping the streets safe. She had thought she was enforcing the law, but now she had put a federal agent's life in jeopardy. Thompson didn't wait for her to recover. "Get her out of holding. Now." The air in the station felt thick with tension when Malcolm Morgan arrived. He didn't storm in. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he moved like a man who had spent years walking through fire and had come out the other side unscathed. His steely eyes scanned the room, cold and calculating, assessing every single person before landing on Thompson. "Where is she?" Thompson motioned toward the holding area, stepping aside as Malcolm walked past him, his movements controlled, deliberate, but dangerously quiet. Inside the cell, Aaliyah sat on the bench, her back straight, her shaved head exposed under the harsh lights. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She sat still, her fingers wrapped tightly around the fallen braids in her lap, as if holding on to the last piece of herself. When her eyes met her father's, something in Malcolm broke. His daughter, the child he had sworn to protect, the one person he had spent his life keeping away from the darkness he worked in, had been stripped of her dignity in the very system he once believed in. And Karen Mitchell had done this to her. Aaliyah stood slowly. "Dad." That was all it took. Malcolm turned and his gaze found Karen. She froze. In his eyes she saw nothing but ice-cold fury. This wasn't the anger of a man who would scream or curse. This was the kind of rage that didn't need words, the kind that promised consequences. Karen's throat went dry. She had made a mistake she might not be able to fix. Thompson stepped forward. "Mitchell," he said, voice clipped. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation." Karen's stomach dropped. "Captain, Save it," Thompson snapped. "I don't want to hear excuses. Get out." Karen swallowed hard, her feet glued to the floor, but under the weight of Malcolm Morgan's stare, she couldn't breathe. Finally, she forced herself to move, pushing past officers who wouldn't even look at her anymore. But just as she reached the door, she heard Malcolm's voice, low, deadly, a quiet promise of what was to come. "This isn't over." And somehow Karen knew. He meant every single word. The world Karen Mitchell once knew was gone. It had only been a few days since she'd arrested Aaliyah Morgan, but in that time, her entire life had unraveled like a thread being pulled from a tightly woven fabric. The media tore her apart. Her name was everywhere. Detective suspended for racial profiling. Police officer humiliates innocent black teen. Social media had turned her into a villain overnight. The news cycle replayed the footage of Aaliyah leaving the station with a shaved head, holding the braids in her hands, over and over. It was all anyone could talk about. Even inside the Midtown North Precinct, her name was poison. Half the officers wouldn't even look at her. The other half whispered about her in the break room, acting like she was a warning rather than one of them. She had spent years building her reputation as a tough but fair cop. But now she was just the disgraced officer who had ruined a federal case, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. "Come in." Captain Henry Thompson sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable as Karen stepped into his office. She had been dreading this moment. Her suspension was still in effect. She had been expecting a formal dismissal, an internal investigation, maybe even criminal charges if Malcolm Morgan pushed for them. But Thompson didn't look like a man about to fire her. He looked calculating. "Close the door, Mitchell," Karen obeyed, her palms sweating as she sat across from him. "I assume you know how badly you screwed up," Thompson said flatly. Karen didn't argue. She had spent the last few nights replaying every moment of that arrest, every bad decision, every mistake. "Yes, sir." Thompson leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Then you also know that firing you won't fix what you did. It won't erase the fact that you put a federal agent's mission at risk. It won't undo the damage you caused." Karen swallowed, her throat dry. "I know." Thompson exhaled sharply, then slid a folder across the desk. Karen hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a photo of Vincent Delgado, one of the most feared criminals on the East Coast. Next to him stood Victor Rios, Delgado's right-hand man. "The FBI needs someone to go undercover," Thompson said. Karen's head snapped up. "Undercover, you want me to? It's not a request," Thompson cut in. "It's an order. This is your last chance, Mitchell. You want to prove you're more than a racist cop? Then do something that actually matters." She stared at the file, heart pounding. Delgado's organization was deadly. His network of arms dealers and drug traffickers had eluded law enforcement for years. Karen had made a huge mistake, but this was suicide. She lifted her eyes to Thompson's. "Why me?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "Because you have something to prove, and because Delgado will believe you. He thinks every cop is either dirty or incompetent. You're already halfway there in his eyes." The word stung, but Karen knew he was right. She had one shot at redemption, and she was going to take it. Karen Mitchell was dead. At least, that's what she needed Victor Rios to believe. She stood at the bar of a Brooklyn dive, nursing a whiskey, her appearance carefully crafted to look like someone who had lost everything. Her hair was messier, her clothes a little rougher, her badge officially surrendered as part of her suspension. Word on the street had already spread that she had been fired, that she had been made an example of. Now, all she had to do was make sure the right people heard her anger. She took a long sip of whiskey and spoke just loud enough for Victor Rios, seated in the back booth, to hear. "You know what the real problem is," she muttered to no one in particular. "Cops don't get paid enough. We risk our lives, deal with ungrateful assholes, and what do we get? Thrown to the wolves." She shook her head, acting the part of a bitter, disillusioned officer. Victor's ears perked up. He was watching her now. Karen slammed her glass down, wiping her mouth before turning toward him. "Word is you're hiring." Victor leaned back, smirking. "And what exactly do you think we do here?" Karen met his gaze without flinching. "I think you make more money in a week than I did in a year." Victor studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Come with me." The deeper Karen went, the more dangerous it became. She had to prove herself, to act the part so well that even Delgado wouldn't question her loyalty. She gave them intel, small pieces, enough to make it seem like she was burning bridges with law enforcement, but not enough to cause real damage. She sold the lie so well that she started to believe it herself. But Delgado was no fool. He had been watching her carefully, testing her. And then, one night, she saw it in his eyes. He was suspicious. The FBI had been planning the raid for weeks. Karen knew the location of Delgado's largest warehouse in Brooklyn, where he was set to meet with buyers from overseas. The second she saw Victor eyeing her differently, she knew she had to move. She activated her hidden signal, the one that told the FBI to move in immediately. Then everything exploded. Gunfire erupted as FBI agents stormed the warehouse, shouting orders. Victor pulled his gun. Karen barely had time to react before he aimed it at Malcolm Morgan. Without thinking, she threw herself between them. A shot rang out. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she stayed on her feet. Malcolm took the shot that should have been his opening, one clean move, and Victor was down. Delgado was next, surrounded, trapped, and furious. Within minutes, it was over. Delgado's empire crumbled, and Karen collapsed, bleeding but alive. When she woke up in the hospital, Malcolm was there. For the first time since that night at the station, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't pure hatred. "You saved my life," he said. Karen swallowed. "I owed you one." Malcolm nodded. Then he glanced toward the door. Karen followed his gaze, and there stood Aaliyah. She was silent for a long moment, then she spoke. "You're not the same person you were." Karen's throat tightened. "I'm trying," Aaliyah nodded. "Keep trying." And with that, she turned and walked away. Karen exhaled, feeling something inside her shift. She had survived the fire. Now she just had to make sure it wasn't for nothing. The melody started softly, gentle notes, rising like a whisper, full of pain but also strength. Aaliyah Morgan sat at her piano, eyes closed, fingertips brushing over the keys, lost in the music. This piece, this story without words, was hers. She had named it Unbreakable, because she had to be. Each note carried the weight of what had happened to her, the humiliation, the injustice, the loss of something that had once made her feel whole. But as the melody swelled, the pain transformed into something else. Power, defiance, hope, and the world listened. The first time Aaliyah played Unbreakable in public, it was at a small recital in a Harlem community center. By the end of the performance, the audience sat in stunned silence. Then the applause erupted, not just polite claps, but a wave of emotion, as if everyone in that room felt what she had felt, had lived it through her music. Someone recorded it. Within days, the video had gone viral. It wasn't just about the beauty of the piece. It was about what it represented. A young black girl, stripped of her dignity by a broken system, had turned her pain into something bigger than herself. The world saw her. The world heard her. Musicians started performing her composition. Schools began using it as a symbol of perseverance and justice. Activists quoted her name alongside those who had fought for change before her. But for Aaliyah, it wasn't about fame. It was about taking back her power. And that was something no one could ever take from her again. Karen Mitchell stared at the resignation letter in front of her. She had rewritten it 3 times already. Not because she doubted her decision. She knew she couldn't stay on the force, but because the words never seemed right. She had been a cop for years. She had believed she was one of the good ones. That belief had shattered the night she met Aaliyah Morgan. Karen had followed orders, followed protocol. But protocol was just another word for a system designed to fail people like Aaliyah. And she wasn't going to be part of it anymore. She signed the letter, set the badge on top of it, and walked out of the precinct for the last time. She wasn't running away. She was choosing a new fight. The first time Karen set foot in the community center for at-risk youth, she felt out of place. She had spent her career locking people up. Now she was here to help them. The irony wasn't lost on her. The center was filled with kids who had grown up fearing the police, kids who had been judged before they even had a chance. Karen didn't expect them to trust her. She didn't expect to feel comfortable. But discomfort meant growth, and she was willing to earn her place. So she listened. She heard their stories, stories that echoed Aaliyah's in ways that made her stomach turn. She worked without the authority of a badge, but for the first time, she felt like she was actually doing something that mattered. She wasn't here to be forgiven. She was here to make sure the next Karen Mitchell never happened. It happened on a quiet afternoon. Karen had stayed late, cleaning up after a mentorship session when she heard it, piano music. She followed the sound down the hallway, pausing outside a small room. Inside, Aaliyah Morgan sat at a piano, surrounded by a group of wide-eyed children, her fingers moving effortlessly across the keys. The song was light, playful, different from the pain Karen had once heard in her music. Aaliyah was teaching them, showing them how to let music tell their stories. Karen watched from the doorway, frozen. She had faced criminals, stared down gang leaders. But standing here, looking at the girl she had once wronged, she felt more afraid than she ever had before. Then, as if sensing her, Aaliyah looked up. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. There was no anger in Aaliyah's gaze. But there was something stronger, understanding. Karen stepped inside, hesitating before she spoke. "You're good with them." Aaliyah simply nodded. The kids, sensing the shift in energy, scattered to another part of the room, leaving the 2 women alone. Karen took a deep breath. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. Aaliyah studied her, then closed the piano lid gently. "I don't hate you anymore," she said. The words hit harder than any punch ever could. Karen swallowed, her throat tight. She hadn't realized how badly she had needed to hear that. Then Aaliyah added, "But make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Karen nodded, her chest feeling lighter for the first time in a long time. "I will." Aaliyah gave her one last look, then turned back to the piano, placing her hands on the keys. Karen watched her play for a moment before quietly stepping back out into the hallway. She knew that nothing she did would ever change the past. But the future, that was still unwritten, and she was going to spend the rest of her life making it better. Aaliyah's music continued to spread. Karen's work at the community center grew deeper. Malcolm Morgan went back into the field, knowing his daughter had turned her trauma into something unstoppable. The world didn't change overnight. It never did. But little by little, note by note, step by step, they were all building something stronger, something unbreakable. And that was just the beginning.